Have a McGhee. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm so glad to be with you, Yascha.
I really look forward to this conversation. I really enjoyed your book, which I read when it came out, and I've really been enjoying your new podcast. The core of your work seems to me to be the idea that we can only prosper together, that we should think of a world in more positive sum terms, and how much we lose when people forget that, how much we lose when racial competition, other forms of competition really do damage to the social fabric.
Mm.
Um, how is that framework sort of different from the ways in which we tend to talk about this topic in American debates today?
Mm. Well, I think there's probably two shifts that I'm making, and that frankly I made over the course of my career. I spent nearly 20 years working at a think tank and public policy advocacy, squarely focused on economic inequality and the political inequality that feeds and creates economic inequality. And so I think one of the shifts is that the dominant way of seeing the relationship between class and race in my field of center left, economics, was that there's an inequality that's driven by policies, tax, trade, etc., and that these forces are driving inequality, and then inequality is sort of accelerated by racism, by discrimination and disadvantage, and so that makes inequality worse for people of color. So that was one sort of conventional wisdom. And so it led us to talk about the solutions to inequality in purely economic terms and have a sort of nice, heartfelt afterthought about the disparate impact on people of color. But it really blinded us, I think, from seeing the way in which, really from a rather sociological, social psychology, political science orientation, that economics needs to understand the way that racism in our politics and our policymaking is actually the driver of inequality in many instances, and it makes inequality worse for everyone. So that's one big shift, as between the relationship between inequality and racism. And then the other is in some ways a more challenging one to a broader set of folks than just the sort of economics field and the field of economics advocates, which is that oftentimes we talk about racial competition, about the story of race and who we are to one another, in a way that even those of us who want to see even those of us who want to see racial equality end up invoking a sort of zero sum paradigm. And that zero sum paradigm is really one that has its, most offensive articulation by people like Donald Trump, the idea that the sort of winners and losers, the great replacement theory, the idea that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense, that we sort of can't share the good things in life, and that we are in this sort of competition for dominance. And yet, I think that sometimes when those of us who want to see a fairer and more just world are trying desperately to pull the wool down from under the eyes of so many people who want to ignore the existence of systemic racism, we insist on talking about white privilege and all of the different advantages that come from being white and the disadvantages that come from being a person of color. And in some ways, we're setting up the same paradigm, the idea that what's good for one group is bad for the other. And because the voices with the sort of ugliest zero sum story are so loud right now, not just in the US, but across the globe, I think that as communicators, it's incumbent upon us to finish the sentence. And by that, I mean, say, yes, there are all of these advantages to being white, to being a descendant of people who were on the upper end of a strict racial caste system. And yet, the world that we are seeking to create is not one where white people have less health care and worse funded schools and more contact with the police and drink more polluted water and breathe more polluted air. It's actually where we all prosper.
Yeah, I was struck by that part of it sometimes on social media. And of course, social media brings out the worst in everybody and in every kind of political position.
Yeah.
There's videos of cops sort of thoughtfully and carefully dealing, for example, with a white person who's mentally disabled.
Hmm.
And people then would post these clips enraged, saying, if this person were black, they would have been treated terribly. And it was nearly like they wanted the cop to treat this white person terribly in that situation. And I understand, of course, where the rage about police violence comes from and so on. But of course, the solution is for the cop to treat everybody in that situation respectfully and safely, rather than to have some kind of equalizing of bad treatment.
Yeah.
I think those are really two very helpful frames. So let's delve a little bit more deeply into each of them. What does it mean that racism has really made inequality worse? You have some
Mm.
very compelling examples of this in Some of Us and other things. How is it that in the course of American history, racism has actually been an obstacle to economic equality and an obstacle to building public goods, from swimming
Mm.
pools to lots of other things that could have um, uh, 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 sustained a more equal and a more flourishing society?
You know, I grew up professionally trying to figure out what had shifted in our economic policy paradigm between the era of the sort of New Deal, the Great Compression, the era of shared prosperity. There are a lot of not so floral ways that economists and advocates describe the period roughly between the 1930s and the early 1970s, when economic and income growth was fast and relatively quite evenly distributed. In fact, the income distribution uh, for that period of time saw the lowest paid households incomes growing actually faster than the highest paid out households. It was, the period of the American dream, of the greatest middle class the world had ever seen, and was brought about by a policy regime of higher marginal tax rates, massive public investments, a lot more regulation, high levels of union density, a minimum wage that was roughly half the median wage, um, you know, lots of benefits with work, etc. And we really had a very dramatic break from that policy regime in the 1970s, accelerating in the 1980s and 90s. And it ushered in what I call the inequality era, right? Where we are today, where 1% of the population owns more wealth than the entire middle class, and half of adult workers are paid too little to meet their basic needs. And so, a big part of the job of being someone who wants to put an end to the era of inequality is to figure out what happened, what were the shifts, what were the policy shifts. And that was sort of obvious, right? You can write an economic history of what changed in our regulatory policy, our tax and trade policy, our labor policy. But what I didn't understand, and often made me feel like I was sort of crazy, right? It was sort of like a gaslighting situation growing up in this era of inequality, and knowing what I did about the economy as I became an adult was why, right? Why would the country that invented this thing called the American dream just like shut the lights out on it, and tolerate this galloping inequality when we had actually responded to the first Gilded Age with this great expansion that was fair? And what was very helpful to me was that I quit my job running a think tank in 2017, and I set out on the road, a series of trips that took me across the country multiple times. I started reading and listening to and talking to scholars of different disciplines than I'd had before in law and economics. And what came together was more was a sort of a better answer, Yasha, for why, right? Why it is that we can't seem to have nice things anymore. And by nice things, I don't mean hovercraft backpacks. I mean things like universal childcare and paid family leave and universal health care and a well-funded school in every neighborhood. And I mean, we, as in white Americans, who are the largest share of the uninsured and the impoverished, and Americans of color who are disproportionately so. And what I came upon was this real thing that I actually walked across physically that actually was also a powerful metaphor for the political and social dynamics that would end up shifting the economy from the golden age of shared prosperity to the inequality era. And the thing that I walked across was a wide, flat expanse of grass where buried 10 feet underground of this lawn is the carcass of a swimming pool that is in Montgomery, Alabama, in their central park called Oak Park. And it used to hold over 1,000 swimmers. It used to be this sort of glorious, well-funded, lavish public swimming pool that was built as part of a building boom in the 1930s and 40s of public goods, roads, bridges, schools, libraries, parks, and these swimming pools that were sort of this glittering reflection of a deeper ethos that said the government is going to be responsible for. It's its duty to ensure an ever increasing standard of life for its citizens. And such nice things as a swimming pool, right, when there wasn't air conditioning, are going to be, part of every flourishing town and county in the country. There were 2,000 of them roughly across the country. And they were usually, certainly in Montgomery, Alabama, very explicitly segregated, but also in the North and Midwest and West. And if it wasn't like with a whites only sign, it would just be this racial segregation enforced by custom and enforced by intimidation and violence. And for me, the swimming pool as literally it was a New Deal WPA creation in many of these places. It was part of a whole ethos. And of course, the things that were public goods that I cared more about were things like Social Security for the elderly, a massive investment in housing that workers could afford, as well as mass home ownership, really kind of an unprecedented commitment to the idea that working class people could um, own something that would be an intergenerational bedrock of wealth that would appreciate over time. The GI Bill, the labor standards and collective bargaining rules in the New Deal, these were all public goods. And Yasha, to a degree that I actually didn't even know. I'm a Black woman. This history that I gleaned and started researching in my journey to write The Sum of Us was history that my own grandparents and great grandparents and parents had lived, and yet I really wasn't as aware as I should have been. It really speaks to blind spots in our education. All of those public goods were in one way or another racially exclusionary. Housing, massive investment, yet predicated on the never substantiated idea that Black people would be too much of a credit risk. Based on maps that the New Deal government commissioned, surveying the greatest metro areas to the block level and showing their racial and ethnic character and designating the ones with high Negro concentration as do not lend areas for private investment, requiring racial covenants, saying that private developments to get any kind of federal backstop insurance would have to be sold to people who were, quote, wholly of the Caucasian race. This is the New Deal government who did this, right? Social Security excluded the two job categories that most Black workers were in a compromise with the South, right? That's domestic work and agricultural work. Even the GI Bill was race neutral on its face, but the benefits were filtered through often racially segregated housing and education sectors. Even the labor standards, right? When so many of the AFL unions were racially exclusionary, it didn't benefit Black workers equally. And so the whole economic system of public goods was like the recreation system of public pools for whites only, largely. But when the civil rights movement empowered Black families to be able to say and get the courts to agree with them, you know, it's our tax dollars that have funded those public goods all along. And in the case of the swimming pools, we want our kids to swim too. Many towns and cities across the country did what Montgomery, Alabama did, and they drained their public swimming pools rather than integrate them. Literally drained out the water, backed up truckloads of dirt and gravel. And this idea of the drained pool for me means so much. It happened all over the country, not just in Alabama, but Ohio, West Virginia, New Jersey, California, Washington State. It signifies what a white population that has been taught to disdain and distrust their fellow Americans will do out of that sort of zero sum mentality that there has to be someone on top and they'd rather destroy a public good than share it. Um, and it was mirrored in a really radical and sudden shift of public opinion among the majority of white voters away from public goods of all kinds, away from a sort of um, economic policy paradigm that said the government should do things like provide a universal basic income and a federal job guarantee. This used to be popular with 70% of white American voters in 1956 and 1960, but by 1963, that share fell in half. In 1964, the share of white voters who wanted this sort of muscular government guarantee of economic security fell in half at the height of the civil rights movement. And so for me, this drained pool politics phenomenon became a better answer to why the American majority would turn their backs on the formula that had created such middle class prosperity and instead say, we're willing to go it alone. We're willing to build backyard swimming pools. We're willing to trust a market that is still going to be far more dominated, frankly, by white men than the public sector. And we are willing, frankly, as W.B. Du Bois wrote, to accept some non-material psychological wages of whiteness instead of actually having higher wages. We're willing to have a real material loss in order to still feel like we are on the top of a really brutal hierarchy.
It's funny, as you were saying these last few sentences, I was reminded that sitting on a train today, I got talking to somebody sitting opposite me, and they told me an old joke, which I think originates in sort of Polish socialism, but it's oddly germane here, which is that some kind of fairy or something turns up and promises a man that he can have whatever he wants. He can have one wish fulfilled, no questions asked. The only thing is that whatever he gets, his neighbor will get twice as much of. And so he thinks for a long while and is really tortured by this. And finally, he has the right response, and he says, "Kill half of my cows." Sorry, let me say this again. And finally he says, "Kill half of my cows." And so there is this kind of deep human psychology of competition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that you would rather be poorer yourself as long as the people who you're in competition with, or you want to feel superior to, or you want to keep down at a lower rung of the social ladder, are even doing worse than you.
Mm-hmm.
So as I understand it, you think that this kind of psychological mechanism in the context of American racism helps to explain not just racial disparities between white and black Americans, but really the sort of turn from a public goods oriented set of public policies in the 1950s and 1960s that sustained social security and investment in local public schools and libraries and all of those kinds of things. And that when Black Americans gained access to those facilities, people start to say, well, in that case, I'm happy for some of my cows to die as long as all of their cows die too. Is that sort of roughly the the causal story here?
Yeah, I think it is. Sociologists would call it last place aversion, right? And I think what's important to me in the Sum of Us, I try to really underscore that this isn't only human nature. This is also a reflection of the fact that everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And there are power dynamics, there are political actors, there are self interested elites who are setting up a system where being on the bottom of the social hierarchy is so miserable that anybody worth his salt would actually try to climb over his neighbor to get away from that bottom rung, right? It's also, if when I tell the economic history in that way of the drained pool politics, there was a political movement that was thrilled to capture white voters away from the party of the New Deal that they had been so supportive of since that time, and move them over to the right on a politics of racial grievance. Once the party of the New Deal also became the party of civil rights, right? And there's that famous Lyndon Johnson quote. Lyndon Johnson, of course, being the last Democrat to win the majority of white voters when running for president to this day, right? He signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, made good on the promise that everyone who contributed to our nation's prosperity should benefit from it. And as he said at the moment, lost the South. What he didn't know was that he lost the white voters in the country overall. But he had this great quote where he says, and I think it's really about it. It illustrates the role of politicians and political storytellers in creating this kill half my cows mentality, which is, he says, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. Right. And so in our politics, emptying his pockets for you is voting for cuts to government services, destruction of union power, shipping jobs overseas, with, tax cuts for the wealthy. And that economic program has been something that the majority of white voters, while many of them have suffered under that economic system, have gladly sort of given over their votes because of marketing to their cultural sense of identity, where they're emptying out their pockets in some ways, in order to be a part of the us that is still, seen as at the core of American identity and reflected in the power structure on the right wing of mostly white men.
So I have a question about this line of argument, though, sort of in the back of my mind as I read your book and what I was reminded of right now, which is a sort of parallel debate that's been happening in European politics and political science about Europe for the last few decades. So there's a few articles that have claimed that support for generous welfare state policies go down in various European countries when there's high levels of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the logic behind that claim is very similar to the logic behind your claim, right? Which is to say, sure, we're in favor of these general programs to provide public goods and so on, as long as, quote unquote, people like you and me benefit from it. But when there's people who I don't trust, or there's people who I feel superior to come in and suddenly they're getting some of the benefits of that, well, in that case, perhaps better abolish it. What's strange about the sort of ideological context is that in the debate about European politics, sort of that argument is treated like a conservative argument, even for the political scientists who have published those papers tend to be on the left, like most political scientists. And there's sort of a very strong rejection of this line of research from the left, because they kind of want to say, well, hang on a second, this would imply that if we want a strong welfare state, we shouldn't have immigrants. And obviously we don't want that conclusion, so let's deny the premise. So I was wondering both, I'm sure you don't want to speak particularly to whether that research is true or not, unless you happen to have looked at it in the European context. But sort of how should we think about that tension, right? Where it feels like there is a liberatory potential in what you're saying, that it's pointing to, if only we overcome that instinct, if only we're able to cooperate, everybody's going to benefit. And that's a really powerful, optimistic story.
Hmm.
On the other hand, of course, it also has the potential of saying, well, so perhaps things just don't work when you have more immigrants in the European context, or
Yeah.
it's just too hard to make this multiracial democracy in America work in the kind of way we would want. How do we deal with the two different ways you could sort of take that line of argument?
Well, as you say in your book, right? This is a great experiment. We haven't figured this out yet. How do you create a multiracial democracy that is equal and where everyone thrives? And so my where I fall in that debate is it is hard, but we can only face and tackle. Sorry, let me say that again. My where I fall in that debate is to say that it is hard, but we can only tackle what we face. And so my intervention in the sort of US kind of progressive economics field with the sum of us has been to say so many of my mostly white class focused right peers um, didn't have a language for why it was so hard for their great ideas about making everybody's lives better were falling on deaf ears among white voters. And many of them didn't know that the majority of white voters had rejected the Democratic Party at the presidential level ever since LBJ signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, right? There was just sort of an ignorance about the correlation between racial resentment and that weakened support and the way that, for example, a white person with a high level of racial resentment against Black people has a 60 percentage points less support for more government spending in general, right? There's really this association in the American political context. I believe it is the case in many European countries as well, but in the American political context, it's very clear, right? Government is the actor that betrayed white voters when it went from being the enforcer of the racial hierarchy, right, drawing the redlining maps, printing the whites only signs, to being the upender, right? And if you ask a sort of grassroots conservatives, um, they will say government is on the side of those other people, right? And whether it's welfare, which sort of is kind of an inflated role of how many people of color are dependent on it, or that it exists really much at all anymore, or, affirmative action also inflated in that it's been, you know, college admissions, for example, a white person is far more likely to be competing with another white person than a person of color, et cetera, right? But so government is really the actor. And therefore, when, liberals ride in on their government horse, they for a long time, and I think this was more acute before Trump made a lot of this more clear, but um, didn't have a language for understanding what was going on, what were the dynamics that were making of public goods, or sort of revival of public goods, less popular among white Americans than it was among people of color. The other thing I'll say, though, is that I think, like you, Yascha, I'm interested. I'm a hopeful person. I think it's worth fighting for this great experiment. I use that word experiment as well. I think it's accurate. Um, and I'm really interested now in the how, right? In what does it take to build a strong, resilient, multiracial democracy? Um, Again, I don't think we have to be ruled by the baser instincts of human nature that are tribal and competitive. I do believe that everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And so we have to, grab hold of the megaphone, and we do need stories to be told that are hopeful, that model for us how to behave, how to treat one another, what to believe about one another. And that's actually why I created the podcast version, the sort of spin-off of the Sum of Us just these past few months, because that audio documentary, which takes me back out on the road to 9 different places in the country, is exclusively focused not on what's wrong with the country and diagnosing the cost of racism to everyone, which is what the book lays out, but the final idea in the book, which is the idea that we can gain through cross-racial solidarity, the idea that I call a solidarity dividend. And so the podcast is me going into communities and finding stories of people actually coming together across lines of race and figuring it out and asking them what it took and how they did it and when they stumbled and how they recovered. And I think that's really, I felt compelled to do that, to get back out on the road in the middle of a pandemic on the heels of the Sum of Us, the book, because honestly, I was intellectually curious. I wanted to know in a deeper way what it takes, particularly now, right, in this moment when most opinion polls say that Americans feel like we are so helplessly, hopelessly divided. And I left that journey more hopeful than I was when I began it.
What made you more hopeful, and what do you think do the people who are able to come together and work together on solving the local problems have in common? What empowers some people to see the positive sum potential, and what I suppose conversely drives other people into that zero sum mentality?
So I'm reminded right now of an episode that we did where I went to rural Maine, small town Maine. And the episode is actually the problem, the social and economic problem is the loss of the family farm. Right, we are losing, you know, just tremendous numbers of farmland and numbers of farmers who are aging out and selling their land, and it's a massive problem for local food systems and for our local, particularly rural economies. And in that episode, a group of Somali Bantu, ethnic Bantu refugees and immigrants who came to Maine after the Somali Civil War and who were met with a lot of grassroots sort of, welcome arms and charity and immigrant integration at the local level, but were also met with, fire and brimstone anti-immigrant politics at the state level and at the municipal level. It was sort of a proto-Trump kind of demonization of immigrants, tying them to welfare, et cetera. And yet, here amidst all of that is this group of Somali Bantu people who were farmers in their homeland. And the community association is led by this amazing man named McGhee. And everyone's working in bakeries and factories and retail stores, but what they really want to do is farm. And he's looks around and sees all this green land. It's rural Maine, and he wonders how does one go about getting some of this land to productive use, And as you can imagine, a refugee Muslim black man looking to buy land in Maine, like what could go wrong, Um, and in the summer of 2020, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and a mass consciousness raising, the largest social demonstration movement in American history, many people across the country who are white begin to ask questions of themselves, their lives, their communities that they have not asked. And so the small organic farmer, family farmer kind of community in Maine begins to ask in this state that's the whitest state in the country, you know, why is farming so white? Why is there like nary a black farmer in Maine, or very few? And it's at that same time that the Somali Association is um, fundraising to buy land in a community land trust. And they're looking to buy the land of a third generation dairy farmer who is totally a white conservative, probably like a little bit libertarian. And the fundraiser ends up taking off like wildfire because of the mass consciousness raising that is happening at the time. And Charlie ends up being, I think, more willing to sell his land to a group of 200 African refugee Muslim farmers because of the popular conversation at the time. I want to say that because the moment, the mass demonstration moment of the summer of 2020 did play an outsized and pivotal role in each of the stories that I ended up finding over the course of this year, 2022. And I think it's important to say that there are so many other things, right, that mattered. Authentic relationships, or organizing, self-awareness, right? And I talk about those in the finale of this series. But I think a lot of the kind of elite chatter about the summer of 2020 and that uprising is that it's gone. Uh, there's a backlash to it. It may have even made the racial conversation worse because it, inflamed the right wing and then demoralized the left. And when I'm out in this country talking to people who are not paid to be politicians, not paid to talk in the media, um, there has just been a quiet shift that I don't think is easily dismissed. The signs are not in the windows of the homes. People aren't, having protests every day, but almost to a person, the people that I talk to in mostly red and purple states uh, had felt some shift, some had learned some things, had asked new questions, had been willing to partner with different people than they would have before 2020. And so I do think that mass movement and, a wall to wall media narrative and sort of elite conversation about what kind of country we want to be matters, right? That storytelling does matter. And I don't think it's easily sort of swept back under the rug. I don't think people can unlearn what they learned at that moment of sort of mass curiosity about racial injustice in America.
That's interesting, and I think it's interesting to think about how the impact of the summer of 2020 was very different, let's say, in already mostly liberal or progressive contexts, where I personally see it as being somewhat mixed, and then in contexts where perhaps people in more conservative parts of the country and so on, where people just hadn't been as aware of some of the injustices or haven't asked those questions, and when we're sort of the moment sort of pushed them to reckon with why are there no black people at the church, why are there
Mm-hmm.
black people in the community, and so on. That's really interesting and inspiring. Just very, very brief last question for listeners who are persuaded and inspired by all of this. What can people do concretely in their lives? What can people do
Mm.
concretely in their neighborhoods, in their communities, that hopefully will push us towards a narrative which understands the potential of the sum of us, rather than pushing us towards a zero-sum politics?
Gosh, thank you for that question. There's some writers on race who say, do the work, get your mind right, understand our racial history, de-bias yourself. I think all that is fine and good, but I'm really more oriented towards action. So, by listening to the Some of Us podcast, you're going to hear the stories of dozens of ordinary people who just took action to join across lines of race and difference to make their communities better. And that's really what I want. To offer up as a way to make you feel better about your country and yourself and your neighbors and your community, stop you from doom scrolling and make you feel like you've done a little bit. It's like exercise, like it actually gets your heart rate going and gets your blood flowing for you to take action. And by that, I mean, there's so many different multiracial organizations in your community that will bring you shoulder to shoulder with and in common purpose with people who share your values, but maybe not your language and maybe not your racial background or your religious background. And those are the kinds of community-based institutions and efforts that I think are going to help us build a better America.
Have a McGhee. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Yascha.